Article 13.
The banner of all memes.
Friendship is based upon confidence. How many climate scientists know who said I'm doing the offensive?
Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Right Opinion, the home of a twat with too much free time. And today we take a break from our normal schedule to take a look at something that matters to me. Most of my videos I put on my channel are topics that I think will have your interest. This is a general philosophy because I like to entertain people and try and find a balance between what I care about and what you care about. Equally, it's a learning process. Finding out this new information and sharing it with you guys is a great experience to me. However, every now and then, I know I have to make a video that won't be the most fun to make and will require a lot of detail. And today is that day, my friends. I held off this for a while, but I knew that I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't actually raise my voice. So let's talk about the EU, because during my time in America, I've been surprised to find that many people do not have a clue how it operates, let alone barely what it is. So consider the next 5-10 minutes a little crash course. The EU is an abbreviation for the European Union, an organization of countries that form its own absolute body, often cooperating and creating legislation to maintain a more cohesive relationship. It was initially born out of the fact politically, Europe has always been a bit of a mess, everyone trying to dominate each other, and to provide almost a grounding central body that would stabilise the lawmaking process. Very modest intentions. Over the years, this has developed with new institutions and initiatives being integrated and established, typically through treaties or directives. Treaties are essentially contracts between countries. That's a very simplified definition, but I just want you to have a general gist of what I'm talking about today. The European Union that we know today was formed by a treaty in 1992 known as the Maastricht Treaty, which aided the transition to the European Union from just beyond an economic community. I'm not going to go into too many more details because they're not entirely relevant. And honestly, it's not the most fun thing to hear. However, it is of importance to have some basic information so that we can apply that and think critically about what we're going to be discussing today and its implications. Because the European Union has been expanding that control over many different disciplines in the last couple decades, and the internet has been of their interest for a while. And there are many concerns over the ownership of intellectual property on the internet, given the new international realms it spans over. In the past, everything that we watch on TV has been through a limited number of corporations who adhere to regulations that they can be reprimanded under if they don't follow. The new domains granted by the internet has created a plethora of content that is exceptionally hard to regulate. However, over the last few years, we have become increasingly aware of this. With this awareness being raised, there have been filters instated to ensure that people aren't profiting off copyrighted content in many places. For example, someone uploading a copyrighted song on YouTube may have it removed or monetized by the original artist. The internet is a place of new opportunity, but it is also a state of great lawlessness. Many of us will remember the ads they put at the start of a film saying, "You wouldn't steal a film," and then trying to apply that to pirating online, because online makes all these forms of media much more accessible. With this in mind, many sites like YouTube are overbearing in their imposition of copyright restrictions. This creates problems for many people, myself included, when they give too much power to the actual claimant to be the arbiter of the content. I've had this experience with individuals in the past, situations where I've been claimed, appealed, and the appeal goes straight to the owner, and they reject it because they care about money more than they care about fair use. The only way I resolved it one time in the past was by threatening a lawsuit. I don't fuck around. It's pretty much understood at this point that the internet isn't going anywhere. However, this also means that other competitors and governments will be under increasing pressure to respond to such freedoms with new restrictions. Now, we've seen this in the US and the EU. This is not a new thing. We already have copyright directives for the internet to try and prevent illegal usage of content, although it is unavoidable to an extent. But the European Union really want to up the regulation with their new copyright directive that closes in on many of the issues that they feel they haven't been stringent enough on in the past. The most notorious component of this little document is something known as Article 13, which has prompted backlash and outcry against many of us internet dwellers. This outrage has been amplified by a collective of media outlets that have been reporting on the content. On one hand, the increased publicity will definitely make people more aware and hopefully vocal in their involvement on such European issues. On the other hand, being opposed to such a thing channeled through outlets like the media can often condense concerns and mean mean that the problems don't resonate properly with the lawmakers. Equally, it enables them to dismiss these concerns as uninformed, ignorant, and reactionary. There is a sensationalist tone to a lot of reporting. However, after reading the article, I think I can explain it and hopefully make a case against the initiative while being mindful of the possible flaws other arguments that have been put forward may have. Because like many legislative bodies, the EU are extremely hard to understand, most likely, maybe intentionally, so that people never really know what they're doing. But still, I bet barely any of you have actually read the article, likely because it's boring as shit, but that's what we'll be working through today. I think it's also worth notifying with the disclaimer that I am a fervent Eurosceptic. I am no fan of the European Union, so there will be some points that definitely reflect that position. Equally, I'll be doing my best to make an unbiased case, and anything that I do feel will attempt to be qualified off factual evidence. I do not think that this legislation in particular is a compelling case for leaving the European Union, and I would urge your opinion to not be swayed by this one piece of law. However, there are some greater discussions about the philosophy endorsed by the institution that can be had. So without further ado, I suggest we dive into that discussion. Alright, so there are a few parts to this article, 8 parts to be specific, so we're going to proceed through them in numerical order, as that seems most sensible. So here is part 1. We open with a fairly routine comment that nation states are responsible to make sure that internet providers and companies are being held to account on this new initiative. The second paragraph of this section requires references to another article, which we'll have a look at, under such a creative name. So the directive in reference sets out the basic rules to copyright in the European Union, and in this instance the 2 points they're referencing are the ones being shown in the image here. Now these specific parts talk about the exclusive rights for the content being held by the copyright owner, and then they list the sort of creators this applies to, and it's pretty much the usual suspects, the ones we would expect. This should be quite simple for everyone to understand. You know, the rights to the money yielded from someone's creative work belongs to the creator. On principle, that's fairly agreeable. I think we'd all concur when I release this video that I should be able to profit off it, providing it's monetized, of course. Now there is a very important detail that we should consider as, quote, good news for us as content creators, and that's this little sentence here. So just to clarify, without prejudice is a legal term for essentially not ignoring, and the exceptions and limitations in this instance are the ones being written on Article 5 of the directive in reference, which does appear to protect our European brand of fair use. So I want to stress, although there are some very clear flaws that we'll address soon, I would hope that this side of fair use will be protected, and the idea that it isn't addressed, being pushed by some outlets, doesn't appear to be completely accurate. The final paragraph of this article addresses the involvement of states, and also the fact the law shall cover non-commercial uploads, which is fairly vague in its language, and not the most appreciated. One can guess that they're referencing the limitations and the exceptions that are included in the other directive, which partly covers non-commercial usage, though I can't be sure. This is once again what has likely raised concerns with regards to the, quote, meme ban. However, to fully understand the concern, it's probably best that we just follow through to the next part. So part 2 is gone. That twat can piss off, it's not our concern. Part 3 is an interesting one. They make reference to another directive, this time Article 14, of another creatively titled piece of legislation. What is that article about then? Well, this article says that a company shall not be held accountable for the information that is posted on that site, providing that they were not aware prior and they act to remove it once being aware. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? Well, you see, in Article 13, they are suggesting that with these new laws, this won't apply. What does this mean? It means that the websites are held accountable for the content posted, even if they're unaware that it's been posted, if it's uploaded illegally, which is a pretty tall order. However, this is followed by a paragraph providing exemptions to this, which is another important clarification to consider. So what is this exactly saying? Well, maybe exacting it is a bit too hard, because it's more the vague expectation that somehow the rights holders are going to be providing each internet service with some information that will allow them to prevent the content from being uploaded. On top of this, when being notified of the infringement, they'll act to remove it as quickly as they can. So essentially, we can see now that the expectations that the European Union are placing on the providers in the past, they have stated that if you have copyrighted material on your site, it's okay as long as you remove it when you see it. What they're saying now is that you have to prevent this copyrighted material from being uploaded in the first place, or else you're completely liable. However, if you fulfill some vague prerequisites, you're not liable. You can see why everything feels up in the air right now. Well, let's carry on reading and see if there's any more juicy meat we can stick our teeth into. Part 5 is what I'd call the empirical clause. It acknowledges that such programs to scan content prior to upload are not algorithms that will come cheaply and would be dangerous to small businesses who do not have the resources to support such technology. Once again, it's really hard to define what's going to break the bank. The only clarification they provide within this article is the distinction of small enterprises, a reference to another article, which I did read, and it just qualifies what is to be considered a small or micro enterprise, nothing of particular bearing on the implications of this article. In a way, this article could be hopeful, as it definitely gives platforms like YouTube some leeway, but it has no scope of that leeway. And I'll explain why that's a problem once we're done with this. So the 6th section doesn't really provide me with too much to say other than it backs up the previous articles with this idea of cooperation between the right holder and the platform. I doubt it's the sort of thing that a copyright holder would actually utilize for many sites, but hey, that's just my estimation. Essentially, it requires the provider to give full disclosure about the nature of the copyright system they're running on the platform to the original artist. Section 7 continues this narrative of the involvement of authority by saying that states have an obligation to make sure that the content of the article is enforced properly. And on top of that, in instances where there is disagreement over the usage or restriction of certain content, there will be a, quote, complaint and redress mechanism, which basically mirrors the current appeals method on YouTube, where it basically becomes a legal ping pong on how fair the use is. The European Union seems motivated to formalize this method by encouraging member states to create independent bodies that would determine how these complaints would be viewed, which is definitely something to take note of. And then we have the concluding part, which basically comments on the member states' collaboration with the process, basically understanding that there is a lot to be learned through this. And this final clause clearly supports the transparency of the process with which it will be conducted with, and hopefully with reporting on certain information. The Commission and member states will develop this idea to become more efficient and work towards a Europe where copyright laws are more fairly and evenly enforced. Now, it's clear that on the surface, this article hasn't been presented with the worst of intentions. They're trying to account for the possible flaws of it by inserting clauses that mean online businesses will hopefully not be compromising their income by censoring every piece of created media. But this plan does seem to reflect a great ignorance held between EU executives in understanding the details of the internet. And I want to be optimistic. I want to believe that they've involved lots of experts in this crafting of the article. But I wouldn't know because a lot of it's done behind closed doors. And the people on the committee that proposed it in the first place couldn't even agree on its terms, which doesn't instill the most confidence. At the end of the day, I want to say that they know what they're doing, but honestly, I can't say that, and I'd lean towards saying they don't, and that these proposed regulations represent a fundamental misunderstanding of how the internet operates. What do I mean? Well, I have a list, we'll get through it all. On YouTube, they have an ever-tightening system in attempt to make sure that people can't bypass or loophole the terms and conditions, and if you upload content, it can be automatically matched with other content, or it can be manually claimed. The system is far from perfect, it has many flaws, but that's kind of accepted. Now, one of the most significant issues that many of us creators have is, as mentioned earlier, how many of these disputes are adjudicated by the copyright claimant, which is an inherently biased mechanism. The EU seeks to correct this by having individual governments set up their own independent adjudication board where they would question whether something is fair use or not. But I'm very skeptical of how the board would operate practically, given the fact that this is something that happens on an extremely regular basis. As said, the internet isn't the same as television. It's not a handful of businesses arguing with a few artists. There are claims, disputes, every single minute, and we are stubborn bastards. How are you going to fairly judge that? And let's remind ourselves, this isn't just YouTube, this is many other sites who will have to integrate these filters, and who knows how many more disputes they will yield. On one hand, I want to view this article favourably. I know people who've lost views and probably money due to people re-uploading their content on non-profit platforms. On the other hand, there is a skepticism that it will be implemented correctly and with the right communication between artist and provider. For example, as a creator, if someone re-uploaded my videos on their Twitter feed, I'd obviously be very unimpressed, but I'd file a complaint and have it removed. If you preemptively apply filters, what is going to be considered fair standards for that content? For YouTube, although the standards they apply are relatively strict, they still have a reasonable limit before they're picked up automatically by the copyright mechanism, so you can use clips with the chance that it's probably fair use. After all, it's unlikely that you'd steal a 10-second clip as a substitute for a whole video. There are no specific standards here, so the issue becomes what is classified by copyrighted content. Is it a 1-second clip? If so, would we have to file an appeal into an independent bureau, which is backed up with thousands more complaints about 1-second clips being copyrighted, even though it's fair use? You see the problem here? The European Union haven't laid out the specific standards for what is considered copyright, which is probably why YouTube are threatening to just shut down uploading for Europeans altogether. I mean, I highly doubt they will, but if I were them, I'd be pretty mugged off too. On sites like YouTube, things are dealt with efficiently, and really no one's uploading absolute substitute content unless the video's been deleted, and even then it's normally claimed. The European Union's initiative seems so vague, and they appear to outsource the power to the individual artist to dictate to the provider what the restrictions would be, but then having an independent board take into account possible fair use when the creator is inevitably claimed based on those restrictions imposed by the original artist. So then they determine when to lower the restrictions. It seems the most complicated way to apply something that has been blatantly oversimplified, which is a very weird way to express my concerns, but that's essentially what they are. And it's frustrating because there are the ideas of things that could be highly beneficial to creators, online creators too, YouTubers even, but it ultimately ends up seeming to be bloated and idealistic. The idea that we can take things down in post should be somewhat satisfactory, as sites with them being considered liable now will likely censor too much to make sure they're not prosecuted for not putting the correct regulations in place, and then having some inefficient government body sort it out. It seems like a very clumsy idea. Now, some might point out the clause of which they shouldn't implement filters if they're too costly, but the European Union fails to clarify if they mean costly in the sense of the current business model or some new one that may be formed from the implementation of this law. Let me try and simplify this because it is quite hard to get my head around it. The EU haven't clarified whether they consider the word costly in the way that it will affect a business's net income by costing so much to just undertake, or costly in the fact that it impacts the profits. For example, if a site has a disproportionate amount of profit that would be hit by implementing these filters, but those filters could prevent abuse of copyright, is that fair or not if the filters themselves aren't particularly costly to the company? These filters will have direct and indirect effects, and yet there is no distinction between them in the article. These are things that need to be explained to people, but instead it's left very open-ended, which rightfully causes concern for businesses and creators alike. We don't know what's going to happen. If the terms of the article were extremely clear-cut, then I guess we wouldn't have a problem. But the problem is, as it always is, the same with net neutrality. People don't know what's coming around the corner, which is why there are a load of operative words. We always talk about what could happen rather than what will happen. For all we know, the effects may be minimal, but we can't trust them, and they haven't given us a reason to trust them. In all candidness, it just seems like a bureaucratic mess. With all these new supposed institutions, it just seems to be representative of an ignorance of how the internet works, and how such an initiative will probably only affect the honest creators, as the dishonest ones will just find loopholes. There is no way to fully control what they're looking to control, and the artists will gain very little from sites by censoring platforms. There seems to be this impression that if they enact this regulation, these artists will begin to make copious amounts of royalties they've missed out on. And I think if that's the expectation, they're going to be severely disappointed. A response to a problem isn't necessarily a solution to the problem, and I bet none of those people who supported this read it particularly meticulously either. And that means we do have some more points that I want to talk about generally within the EU. I think that whatever the implications are of Article 13, it is the constant unknown factor that plagues creators and businesses alike. Do I think that Google, YouTube are probably overstating the possible ramifications of the article to rile up audiences? Sure, but equally, is this something that you're willing to test out? And let me tell you, with the EU, it's not easy to get off the roller coaster once you're on it. For me, this is an even greater issue than that of legislation that's been discussed in the US, because at least there, if it doesn't work out, you might be able to select a candidate who will try and overthrow whatever legislation you might find contentious. I mean, not always, but at least there's some sort of grassroots movement that can reflect the popular concern. The branch that proposes legislation in the EU is known as the Commission. They're not elected by us. We have no power over who is in the Commission, and so they have a lot less accountability than your standard politician. The democratically elected part of the European Union is the Parliament. However, the Parliament have no power to propose legislation, only to vote and propose amendments. Now, what normally happens when you have controversial legislation is what happened with this one. The Parliament voted against proceeding to further negotiations, there were a few minor changes made, and then it was sent back again. And this time, suddenly they've been won over, and they joyfully vote it through. Now, following this, there's an additional negotiation phase between the three bodies of the European Union, which are the two we've already spoken about, the Commission and the Parliament, and the third one, known as the Council, which has diplomats representing each nation's interest. Eventually, they come to an agreement and it's implemented. And this is one of the problems. Who's going to repeal it once it's implemented? That's what we should be concerned about. If the Parliament, the only democratically elected body, can't introduce legislation, what power do we have to reverse this? It would be a huge uphill battle. I mean, the Commission is technically elected, but the Council are the ones who propose the politicians for the Commission, and the Parliament once again only have voting rights, and they have seldom really tested them because of a problem with Parliament that I'm going to describe very soon. So there is one more vote, and I'll discuss that at the end, which is why there can't really be any chances taken right now. Because they're not willing to be completely transparent about the implications, we don't know what will happen, and we don't know how much chance we'll have to make these changes in the future. That's why it's important to be vocal. One of the biggest problems is that people aren't involved with the EU. Therefore, there's very little drive to reform it in a way that we can have more influence, and the EU itself hasn't tried hard enough to involve people. There is a great disinterest because people don't feel like they have influence, and why would they invest themselves when they can't affect the politics? It's like the recycling paradox. A person won't recycle because they think that one bottle won't have a significant effect on the planet, but if everyone thinks like that, then there could be sizable damage done. Many people don't involve themselves with politics because as individuals they feel their influence is futile, and they are not wrong, but if everyone changed their mindset, then we'd have more power. The European Parliament is all we have currently, and maybe they'd listen to the people a bit more if there were consequences for their actions. Unfortunately, right now, an astronomically higher number of people do not follow the European Parliament. Many people do not know how it works, and therefore they push through a lot of legislation that many of us, if we were aware of, would probably oppose. Article 13 faces more formidable opposition because the internet hooks people up in a way that can unite a cause of interests. But when it comes to election day, the people who voted these things through will likely face no repercussions because people have no interest in how the European Parliament votes otherwise, and the EU make very little effort to promote this. Of course, when they fund some community centre in your village, they'll be sure to stick a plaque advertising their generosity, but there's little to no interest to what actually goes on politically day by day. People are alienated from it, and unless there are severe attempts to reform, we will suffer at the hands of corrupt politicians who have ulterior motives, or at politicians who are so carried away by their visions of what they want Europe to be that no one will stop them to perhaps reconsider how these policies will affect people. The problem is that although we have a very concentrated vocal outcry as internet dwellers, if we let this policy pass and if we let politicians feel secure in their position, they won't think about what could happen. And unless you go out to actively vote against people who may pass damaging legislation, then they won't have any reason to listen to you. It's exactly why many politicians in certain countries for the last few years pass policies that hit the younger population the most, because they're the most politically inactive. You have to make these politicians feel responsible for your well-being. Without that, you have to rely on their goodwill. Look at this man. Do you trust his goodwill? I sure as hell don't. And you know what? Maybe that's why I'm very cynical of the European Union. I hate the establishment. I try not to put my future in the hands of anyone else bar myself, which is probably why I do YouTube, because I have less people to answer to. This feels like a big deal to many of us right now, but we have to remember that to many people, they don't watch YouTube. They'll never hear about this. And this will be out the window by the next election. And these people who don't know will go out next election and vote for whatever party they voted for 5 years ago because there are some vague alignments with their domestic values. Even though the EU policies are a drastically different barrel of fish. And I hope I've explained that well enough today. So I'm going to leave some links down below where you can write to your local MEP. Please do your best to stay up to date with them. Try not to forget about this when the next EU election comes around if you can vote and if that policy has affected you negatively or many people you care about for the gain of a privileged few, then make that vote clear. But equally, I worry that this won't be enough and that if this passes, it will become part of an irreversible past. One part of me says that this should be fine and will find ways to negotiate a fair law that takes into account fair use. But another part of me says it's not being assured by the current legislation, and I don't think it's worth the risk. I really can't see much positive yielding from this in its current form, and I think the artists who believe they've been disenfranchised and the legislation will generate lots of revenue will be sorely disappointed. Many of the solutions seem impractical and short-sighted, and there's still time for it to be improved. You know, if you have some laws in place to expand on sites like Twitter, I could be interested in that. People's art doesn't deserve to be plagiarized. But as it is extremely important that we are vocal on where we stand with such laws, and that as people who've experienced such filters and often their inaccurate outcomes, we let them know that this isn't some easy fix. Equally, it's important to look at ourselves, see what we can do in the future to have people who will represent our interests while also looking at the questionable democratic deficit that exists in places like the Commission and the power that they may hold. If you love the EU for what it could be and want to stay in it, then I respect that a hell of a lot. I personally don't have the faith, but I equally accept that I may be wrong. However, I'd also stress that if you want it to be better, understanding the weaknesses and exactly how that can be taken advantage of by people who may lack the experience or the ethics to behave responsibly is a real concern. And having a more popular voice that represents all these experiences that we've discussed today and not just businesses and politicians is definitely important. We care about this and we need to follow that through with a conviction. And so as said, I'll leave you with the basics in the pinned comment to follow through with. But it doesn't have to stop there. There's always more we can do, and do it if you can. It might just make a difference. So that was my video, my bit more serious video, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it's provided some insight and maybe some education and some knowledge in a digestible fashion, because I know it's quite heavy stuff. I would love to hear what you think in the comment section below. Once again, I want to give a big thanks to my editors. They've done a great job. I'm going to leave their links in the pinned comment. Please check them out if you have the time. Drop them a subscription. Some of them do great work. Check them out and send them some love. Also, I want to thank my Patreons who are currently on screen right now. They do a fantastic job of supporting me, and they really do make a difference when YouTube isn't feeling so charitable. The one specific person I want to thank is my $100 Patreon, Ryan, who is a very lovely person, and I'm really flattered. I'm not sure $100 is what I'd do with my money, but, you know, wow. I love him a lot. It really does make a huge difference to me to have someone that, you know, enthused about my content. And it is really good to see all the feedback. The only thing else I want to say is that future events that I'll be attending. I'm going to be attending Insomnia, which is going to be Easter weekend, I believe, or something around then. Also, VidCon, July the 10th to the 13th. Both of those are in 2019. I have complete intentions to go, and I would love to meet some of you guys there if you're interested too. I don't really have much else to say. Everything's going great recently with the YouTube channel, so hopefully by the time this is up, things are still going great, though I might be cursing it, for all I know. Until then, I'm The Right Opinion, and I'll see you in the next one.